I've always believed that silence can be both a shield and a prison. For years, I chose silence because it was easier than fighting a family that never truly accepted me. My name is Sophia Reynolds, and the night my father-in-law turned 70 was the night everything changed. That evening, I stood in front of the grand mirror in our bedroom, adjusting the simple navy blue dress I had chosen for the occasion. It wasn't designer, it wasn't flashy, but it was elegant. I looked composed, calm, the perfect daughter-in-law on display. "Are you ready yet?" my husband Ethan called from the doorway. His tone wasn't impatient, it was indifferent, which somehow hurt even more. "Yes," I replied softly, turning to face him. He looked perfect, of course, tailored suit, polished shoes, that smug confidence his family seemed to carry like an heirloom. "Try to smile tonight," he said, adjusting his cufflinks. "Dad's friends are going to be there. Don't make things awkward like last time. That was his polite way of reminding me that his family still hadn't forgiven me for not coming from their world. I was raised by a single mother, worked my way through college, and built a modest career in consulting before I met Ethan. But to them, I was simply the outsider, the girl who married up. I nodded silently, even though my stomach churned. When we arrived at the Reynolds estate, the grand lights, the valet parking, and the laughter echoing through the marble halls all felt like a reminder that I didn't belong here. "Ethan, over here." His sister Charlotte waved from across the room. Her diamond necklace sparkled under the chandelier as she kissed me, her smile tight and polite. "Lovely dress," she said, her eyes scanning me from head to toe. "It's simple, refreshing, I guess. Thank you," I said with the same fake smile I'd learned to wear around her. Dinner was set for 70 guests, business partners, old friends, extended family. The Reynolds patriarch, Richard Reynolds, was the star of the night, a man of wealth, influence, and ego big enough to fill the ballroom twice over. I had spent days helping plan the event, yet as soon as I arrived, it was as though I were invisible. No one acknowledged me except with condescending smiles. Every conversation I tried to join quickly shifted away. Halfway through the evening, Richard stood to give a speech. 70 years. He began, his voice deep and proud, and still running this empire like it's day one. The crowd chuckled. He talked about his legacy, his family, his company, his success. And then, as if on cue, Charlotte interjected, and of course, our dear Ethan, the future CEO of Reynolds Industries. Applause, laughter, cameras, and his lovely wife, Sophia, Richard added, the word lovely sounding more like tolerable. She's still finding her place in the family, aren't you, dear?" The room erupted in polite laughter. My cheeks burned, but I forced a smile. Ethan didn't look at me. He just sipped his wine. I wanted to disappear. Later, when the guests began mingling again, I stepped outside to catch my breath. The night air was cold, crisp, and sharp like the truth I kept biting back. That's when I overheard them, Richard, Charlotte, and Ethan, standing near the terrace doors. "She doesn't fit, Dad," Charlotte whispered. "I know," Richard replied. "She's not. One of us, but Ethan made his choice." "She doesn't bring anything to the family," Ethan added quietly. "I've told her to stay out of business matters. She wouldn't understand anyway." My breath caught. Not one of them knew I was only a few feet away. I had spent years downplaying my intelligence, hiding my success before marriage, because I thought humility would earn me respect. I had never told them that I once managed corporate strategies for one of the biggest firms in New York, or that I had quietly built my own consultancy under a pseudonym. To them, I was just Ethan's quiet, unremarkable wife. I turned away before they could notice me. My heart pounded not from pain anymore, but from something colder. Determination. When I walked back into the party, I noticed a group of older men entering new guests, evidently business associates of Richard's. One of them, tall with silver hair and a commanding presence, caught sight of me instantly. His eyes widened. "Sophia," he said aloud, surprised. The room quieted slightly. Richard turned. Ethan frowned. The man, Mr. Alan Pierce, Richard's long-time business partner, walked straight toward me with a broad, astonished smile. "My God, it really is you. Sophia Mitchell, the strategist who saved the Bexford merger 3 years ago." A stunned silence fell across the crowd. I froze. Every eye in the room was suddenly on me. Richard blinked. I'm sorry, what?" Alan laughed lightly. "Richard, I didn't know this was your daughter-in-law." You never told me Ethan married the Sophia Mitchell, the one Forbes called the quiet genius behind multiple corporate turnarounds. Murmurs spread. Charlotte's face went pale. Ethan's jaw tightened. I stood still, my heart racing, as realization washed over the entire Reynolds family. For years, they had looked down on me unaware that the simple girl they dismissed had once outsmarted half the corporate boardrooms they idolized. Richard's voice cracked slightly as he said, You worked on the Bexford deal." "Yes," I said calmly, meeting his gaze, among others. For the first time, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like an outsider. I felt powerful. Alan smiled proudly. "Richard, you've got quite a woman in the family." If I'd known, I'd have offered her a position in my own company. Gasps, murmurs, envy. Charlotte fumbled for words. Ethan looked like he'd swallowed glass, but I simply smiled and said, "Thank you, Mr. Pierce. I've taken a step back from consulting recently. Family matters." Richard forced a chuckle, clearly embarrassed. Yes, Sophia's always been. Modest, that word again, but tonight modesty had turned into revelation. As the whispers continued and glances darted around the room, I excused myself quietly and walked toward the terrace. The night air didn't feel so cold anymore. For the first time in years, I wasn't the outsider. I was the mystery they all wished they had known sooner. But deep inside, another realization took root. If they thought tonight was shocking, they had no idea what was coming next. Because I wasn't just going to let them regret underestimating me. I was going to make them pay for it. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of our penthouse, spilling over the marble floor like a quiet accusation. Ethan sat at the breakfast table, scrolling through his phone, his jaw tight and his coffee untouched. He hadn't said much since last night, neither had I. I could still see the flicker of shock on his face when Alan Pierce had recognized me. The humiliation that followed for the Reynolds family was subtle, but it burned in the air like static, every guest whispering, every pair of eyes darting toward me as if I had betrayed their carefully maintained illusion. Now the silence between us was heavy, and I let it stay that way. So I said finally, stirring my coffee, "Interesting night, wasn't it?" He looked up sharply. "You could have told me." I raised an eyebrow. "Told you what, Ethan? That I have a career. That I'm not the decoration you think I am." "That's not what I meant," he said, though his tone betrayed his irritation. "Dad was blindsided. Everyone was. Everyone." I repeated slowly, "except me." He didn't have a response for that. I smiled faintly and took a sip of my coffee, savoring the quiet satisfaction that came from watching him squirm. The truth was, I hadn't planned for Alan Pierce to reveal my past, but fate had done me a favor. The foundation of their arrogance had cracked, and I was ready to widen it into a fault line. That day, while Ethan left for work, I sat in my study, the one room in this house that was truly mine. I opened my laptop, logged into my private consultancy system, and pulled up a few files I hadn't touched in over a year. I had walked away from that world when I married Ethan, thinking love would be enough. But now, love was nothing but a faded photograph, and business was war. Richard Reynolds' empire had been built on calculated charm and ruthless decisions. His company, Reynolds Industries, was powerful, but beneath the surface, I knew its vulnerabilities. Ethan had let slip too many things over the years, little details he thought I wouldn't understand, but I did. I always did, and now I was going to use that knowledge. Over the next few weeks, I worked quietly in the early mornings before Ethan woke up, and late at night when he was too busy networking or pretending to care about our marriage. I reached out to a few old contacts discreetly. People who owed me favors, people who respected my name in the corporate world. My plan wasn't to destroy Reynolds Industries outright. Not yet. My plan was to shift the power, to make them depend on me before realizing what I was truly capable of. Meanwhile, at family gatherings, the dynamic had changed completely. Charlotte's fake smile had grown tighter, her compliments more forced. Richard tried to act as if nothing had changed, but every now and then, I caught him studying me, calculating, assessing. And Ethan was unraveling. He started drinking more, staying late at work, coming home irritable. The man who had once believed he was destined for greatness was now haunted by the shadow of his wife's hidden brilliance. One evening, as I was reading in the living room, he came home, the smell of whiskey clinging to his expensive suit. So he slurred slightly, dropping onto the couch. I heard Alan Pierce reached out to you. I looked up, calm. Yes, he did. He wants to collaborate on a consulting project. Apparently, he trusts my expertise. Ethan scoffed. You're doing this to embarrass me, aren't you? I tilted my head. Embarrass you? No, Ethan. I'm just doing what I'm good at, something your family never let me do. He stared at me for a long moment, then muttered, You think you're better than us now. I smiled faintly. No, Ethan, I've always been better. You just never noticed. His expression hardened, but he didn't argue. He couldn't, because deep down he knew it was true. By the end of the month, Alan and I had finalized a partnership on a small-scale project, one that, coincidentally, intersected with Reynolds Industries' upcoming expansion plans. It was the perfect setup. I knew that if I positioned myself strategically, I could influence the outcome of that project and, in turn, the future of their company. But to do that, I needed information from the inside. That's where Grace, one of the junior analysts at Reynolds Industries, came in. I'd met her once at a corporate retreat years ago, a smart, ambitious woman who hated how the Reynolds family treated lower-level employees. She was more than happy to share internal updates in exchange for a quiet favor or two. Through Grace, I learned that Ethan was pushing for a risky investment deal, something that Richard wasn't entirely sure about but had agreed to because he wanted to trust his son. The deal was dangerous, unstable, and if executed poorly, could cost the company millions, and I was going to make sure it did. Over the next few weeks, I subtly redirected Alan's interest toward a rival project, one that would directly compete with Ethan's deal. I made sure the paperwork moved slowly, that the right people asked the wrong questions at the perfect time. Soon, cracks began to appear. Richard started questioning Ethan's judgment in board meetings. Investors became nervous. Rumors spread that the company was facing internal conflict. And in the middle of it all, I remained calm, distant, untouchable. Ethan came home one night furious. Did you talk to Alan about the project? He demanded. Yes, I said simply. Why? Because he's backing out. He says he doesn't trust our numbers anymore. I looked at him, my expression unreadable. Maybe he found someone more reliable. His face turned red. You did this, didn't you? I set my book down gently. Ethan, I don't need to sabotage you. You're doing that all by yourself. He stormed out, slamming the door, and for the first time, I didn't feel a single pang of guilt. Weeks later, the collapse of Ethan's project became public. The board lost confidence in him, and Richard, furious about the losses, began to sideline his own son for major decisions. It was poetic. The same man who once dismissed me for being unfit for the family business was now watching his own blood ruin it, but I wasn't done yet, because my revenge wasn't about destroying Ethan. It was about control, quiet, elegant control. And so, when Alan offered me a seat on his advisory board, I accepted, fully aware that this move would make me a direct competitor to the Reynolds empire. At Richard's next board dinner, Alan introduced me formally as his new partner. The silence that followed was almost musical. Sophia, Richard said, struggling to maintain composure, I didn't realize you were branching out. I smiled sweetly. You didn't realize a lot of things, Richard. Charlotte's fork froze halfway to her mouth. Ethan stared down at his plate. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of their stares, and finally allowed myself the luxury of satisfaction. For years, they had tried to make me feel small. Now, every one of them had to look up to me. And they had no idea that this was only the beginning. By the time winter came to Chicago, I had become someone else entirely. The woman who once stood quietly in the shadows of the Reynolds family now stood in boardrooms, commanding attention, respect, and quiet fear. Every move I made in the months after that dinner was strategic, calculated to the smallest detail. Alan Pierce and I had expanded our business partnership, and within half a year, Pierce Global became the largest competitor Reynolds Industries had ever faced. And the irony, their downfall was happening in plain sight, and they didn't even realize I was the architect behind it all. Ethan's project failure had cost them millions. Richard's investors were pulling out one by one, choosing to move their money toward more stable leadership. The press began whispering about internal corruption, poor decisions, and mismanagement, and at the center of those whispers was me, not as a suspect, but as a rising star. I had learned something powerful. You don't destroy arrogant people by fighting them head on. You let them destroy themselves while you hand them the matches. It was mid-January when I received the call I had been waiting for. Richard Reynolds wanted to meet me, not as family, as a businesswoman. The irony made me smile. We met at a quiet, upscale restaurant, the kind where the waiters wore white gloves and the sound of clinking glasses echoed like whispers. Richard arrived first, his once confident posture now slightly bent, the stress of his collapsing empire showing in his face. "Sophia," he greeted stiffly, "thank you for agreeing to meet." I smiled politely, of course. It's been a while since we've had a civil conversation. He exhaled deeply, leaning forward. "Look, I won't waste your time. You and Pierce have grown faster than I expected. Your company's taking a significant share of the contracts we used to hold. That's business, Richard," I said gently. "Markets shift." He hesitated. "I want to make a proposal." I raised an eyebrow. "A proposal?" "Yes," he said, lowering his voice. "Join Reynolds Industries. Bring your expertise back into the family. You can help us rebuild. I'm willing to offer you a major position, vice president, maybe even co-chair." It took everything in me not to laugh. For years, I had begged for a seat at that table, not for power, but for belonging. They'd ignored me, ridiculed me, told me I wasn't good enough, and now they were coming to me, asking for help. "How generous of you," I said finally, my tone laced with polite sarcasm. "But I'm afraid I can't accept." He frowned. "Why not?" "Because I don't work for people who once treated me like I was beneath them," I said calmly, "and certainly not for men who never respected what I was capable of." His face hardened. "You'd let the family business fall apart just to prove a point." I smiled softly. "No, Richard. I'd let it fall apart because it's your point, not mine." He sat back, defeated, his pride cracking under the weight of his own choices. And I stood, leaving him there with the same silence he had once given me. That night when I returned home, Ethan was waiting drunk, angry, broken. "You did this?" he hissed. "You and Pierce. You've ruined everything." I dropped my purse on the counter, unbothered. "Everything? No, Ethan. I simply exposed what was already weak. You turned my father against me. You made me look like a fool. You didn't need my help for that," I said quietly. He slammed his glass against the wall, shards scattering across the floor. "You think you're better than me?" I met his bloodshot eyes without flinching. "I don't think I am, Ethan. I know I am." His hand twitched for a split second. I thought he might hit me, but he didn't. He just stared at me, trembling, realizing for the first time that I wasn't afraid of him anymore. "I'm done," I said, my voice steady. "The house, the name, the marriage, keep them all. They mean nothing to me now." I turned toward the door, but before I left, I looked back one last time. "You once said I'd never understand your world," I said softly. "Turns out I built a better one." The divorce was quiet but brutal. Ethan tried to fight for assets, for reputation, for whatever scraps of dignity he had left, but I had documentation, evidence, and influence. Every lawyer in town knew better than to stand against me. When the case closed, I walked out with my freedom, my company, and my silence, the most powerful weapon of all. Reynolds Industries filed for bankruptcy 6 months later. Pierce Global, my company, acquired several of their assets at a fraction of their worth, and the headline that week made everything worth it. Sophia Mitchell Pierce, the woman who outplayed the Reynolds empire. 1 year later, I stood on the balcony of my new Chicago apartment, overlooking the city lights that shimmered like 1,000 tiny victories. Alan had retired and made me sole CEO of the company. People who once ignored me now sought my advice. The same society that had whispered about my modest background now praised me as a visionary, but beyond all the recognition, what mattered most was the peace inside me. Not because I had destroyed them, but because I had found myself again. Sometimes revenge isn't about rage, it's about reclamation, taking back the parts of you that others tried to bury. As I stood there, the wind tugging gently at my hair, I whispered to myself, they thought I was invisible, but I was just waiting for the right moment to be seen. And when I finally was, I made sure they never forgot it.